Hi everyone, welcome back to another lesson of Russian for Beginners. Today we're going to be finishing our two-part lesson on the prepositional case. So if you haven't seen the first part of that, I would recommend that you go and check that out now, which covers the basics of how to put nouns into the prepositional. Today we're going to be looking at the differences between v and na. We're also going to be introducing you to the prepositions pri and po, and then I'll show you some expressions which use the prepositional case. Just a quick note, this is going to be quite a technical, in-depth lesson, so it can act more as a reference guide for you than anything else because there's a lot to take in, and don't worry if you don't take it in all at once. So with that said, let's get started. So the majority of this lesson and what we're going to look at now is the specific uses of the prepositional case and when you should be using v or na. The prepositional case in Russian is primarily used to define location, to describe where something or someone is. And both v and na can be used to do this, so it can be a bit confusing, but there are some rules guiding which to use, which we're going to go through in this lesson. So generally, v refers more to enclosed spaces, such as institutions, organizations, offices, houses, banks, and so on and so forth. V is also more common to say inside of something or submerged or surrounded by something, and we'll get into that a bit later on in the lesson. Finally, it can also be used to say in a group of people. So here are some examples. Она сидела в комнате. Она сидела в комнате. She was sitting in the room, and because the room is enclosed, it uses v. Мы читали в библиотеке. And again, because biblioteka, meaning library, is an enclosed space, it uses v. So with na generally refers to open spaces, which are not limited from above, but it can also be used to discuss events or event venues. And this can get a bit confusing because a lot of event venues are also enclosed spaces. So unfortunately, you kind of just have to remember which nouns take v and which take na. So na is also the word that you would use almost all of the time to translate the English on top of, or on the surface of. So here are some examples. We have Мы были на вечеринке. And because party, вечеринка, is an event, it takes на. Я была на концерте. Similarly, concert, it's an event with a set kind of time limit, so it's на. Ты видишь папу на улице. And because улица, street, is not limited from above, it's not enclosed, it takes на. Finally, его книга на столе. Его книга на столе. His book is on the table, and because it's on or on top of, then it uses на. So now that you know some of the general rules guiding whether to use v or na, see if you can guess here which nouns take which prepositions. So let's have a look at this first sentence. Дети смотрят телевизор. And because квартира is an enclosed space, it's going to take v. В квартире. And it's pronounced more like F here. So дети смотрят телевизор в квартире. That pronunciation rule, it's quite common with v before hard consonants. So it's just в квартире. Kind of joins on. Second sentence, девочка играет футбол. And because футбольном поле means on the football pitch, which is an outdoor open space, it takes на. Девочка играет футбол на футбольном поле. Well done if you got that right. Third sentence, я работаю. And because office is an enclosed space, it just takes the regular v. Я работаю в офисе. And here, because it's a vowel, V is pronounced V. Я работаю в офисе. Sentence 4, in the glass there is water. So it's because it's kind of submerged in the glass and the glass is enclosed. This is kind of a tricky one. But because it's inside, it means inside, then it takes v. So в стакане есть вода. В стакане есть вода. And lastly, we have я заснул in the lecture. So this is kind of on the fence. It might be difficult to guess, and don't worry if you don't get it. But лекция, meaning lecture, always takes на. That's kind of could be an exception. Just think of it as an event. A lecture is an event that you go to specifically for a lecture. Whereas like with kvartira, komnata, you don't go to them specifically for a certain amount of time for a certain event. So next we have some tables. So this is a list of nouns which take v. Most of them are enclosed. We have park and garden, which take v all the time, but obviously they're not enclosed, so they're just exceptions. And then on the right in the yellow box, we have exceptions for nouns you would expect to take v, but they actually take na. And unfortunately, you do just have to kind of remember these. So, for instance, na kuchnia, you would think kitchen took v, but it takes na, and so on and so forth. So just a quick note on some words here. We have vokzal and stancija, which both mean station. The only difference is that vokzal is generally a larger station, and stancija can refer to a small station with just one platform, and you know, it's a smaller place. Vokzal is like a main train station. Then zavod and fabrika, they both mean factory. The difference here is kind of not familiar to English speakers. So zavod is more industrial. It can be referred to as a plant, and it just creates like chemicals, motors, large things basically, whereas fabrika is referring to somewhere that creates smaller things. So for instance, cloth factory, paper mill, somewhere that produces or packages food, those would be fabrika. So next we have another table. So this shows some nouns that take na, and then we have some exceptions which you might expect to take na, but they actually take v. So yeah, it can be a bit confusing. These are more like reference guides that you can come back to if you need to remember which noun took v or which took na. So don't worry about trying to remember all of this at once. So a lot of these are events. So we've got opera, exhibition, ballet, and so on and so forth. Then I've just put a list of the educational departments and faculties that I mentioned earlier, which would take na. And then in the exceptions, we have в путешествии, в поездке, в дороге, в отпуске, and so on and so forth. And then we have в кино. So the cinema, you would expect it to take na. В театре, you would expect it to take na because they're events or event venues, but they just always go with v. So this is showing groups of people which usually take v, and then we've got the word kurs, which always takes na kursje. So kurs can mean like a language course or just a skills course that you're taking, but it can also mean a year in an educational institution. So you could say я на втором курсе. Я на втором курсе. I'm in my second year at university, for instance. So here are some examples of when na is used to say on or to refer to something in an open space. You may notice that some of the nouns have funny forms in the prepositional. For instance, have a look at bridge and shore, which look like namastu and na beregu. We've also got corner, which is na uglu. And we'll be discussing that more towards the end of this lesson. It's just a rule that some nouns have irregular forms in the prepositional, so don't worry about that too much now. We will cover that later on. And then we've got some exceptions which you would expect to take na, such as город, meaning city or town, центр, meaning center of a city, zoopark. So that's kind of a funny pronunciation. It's just like there's two A's, and then the stress, is on the last ark. So it's zoopark, zoopark. And then we have предприятие, meaning enterprise or business, and all of and you would expect that to take v, but it takes na. So yeah, that is all we have on this first section. Now on to the next use of the prepositional case. So the second use of the prepositional case, as you might notice, it's quite similar to the first in that it does relate to location, but now we're going to be focusing on geography specifically, so countries, natural features, and cities. So v is almost always used to refer to countries. For instance, on живет в Великобритании. On живет в Великобритании. He lives in Great Britain. And мы живем в России. Мы живем в России. We live in Russia. However, the main exception to this is islands, archipelagos, and peninsulas, where na is almost always used. So na Kubie in Cuba, or na Poloostrovie on the peninsula, na Poloostrovie. And then we have natural features / climactic zones. So this is a bit trickier because it's not always clear what rule is governing whether to use v or na. I haven't been able to find any rule really that distinguishes the nouns, as we'll see in a table that I've put out in the next slide. But there is a clear distinction with bodies of water because v refers to something that's inside the water, it's submerged in water, whereas na generally refers to things that are on top of the water or on the surface, just on the surface of the water. And then finally we have mountain ranges, which we're going to go into more detail about, and v is generally used for mountain ranges that have plural names, so the Alps, the Andes, etc. And na is used for mountain ranges which have singular names. So it's kind of random. These are just hopefully rules that can help you to decide whether to use v or na. Here we have another exercise for you to practice using v and na. So again, it's fill in the gaps. Let's just start going through them and hopefully it will become clear why v or na is required in each sentence. Девочка видит рыбу blank море. So the girl sees a fish. A fish in Russian is ryba, ryba, in the sea. So because it's submerged in water, it's beneath the surface, and it could be seen as inside, then it's going to be v. It's going to take v. Девочка видит рыбу в море. Secondly, мы живем blank Франции. So because France is part of the mainland, it's not an island, it takes v. But because it starts with a kind of cluster of consonants, to make it easier to pronounce, in Russian you write v. So мы живем во Франции. Во Франции. Мой папа живет. Now because Jamaica is an island, it takes на. Мой папа живет на Ямайке. Мой папа живет на Ямайке. Fourth, очень красиво, blank Alpach. So that is the Alps, and because it's in the plural, in Russian it takes v. Очень красиво в Альпах. Очень красиво в Альпах. And then lastly we have in the forest it is dark. So темно is it is dark, and лесу is the prepositional form of лес, which means forest. So you could think of this as when you're in the forest, you're surrounded by the trees, you're submerged in the middle of the forest, and therefore it takes v. В лесу темно. В лесу темно. Here we have a list of countries and continents and geographical features with the prepositions that they take. So let's start with the countries and continents on the left. Just one thing I wanted to mention in here was Ukraine. So either v or na can be used. Previously, na was more common. As in English, it's kind of the equivalent of saying the Ukraine, na Ukraine. Whereas now it's more common to say just Ukraine, which would be like v Ukraine. Then we have some exceptions. For some reason, Alaska is na Alyaska, na Alaska. And the Caucasus, probably because it's a mountain range, and in Russian it's singular, it takes na, so na Kavkazia, and we'll see that in the next slide as well. Then homeland, Narodinya, Narodinya, takes na. And finally, Rus, which is the medieval Russian state, it's like ancient Russia, takes na, so na Rusi, na Rusi. But if you qualify it with the word drevny or any other adjective, then it takes v, drevny Rusi. So drevny means ancient in ancient Russia. Then on to the right, we have a list of some islands. So it would be na Ostrovje, na Kubje, na Jamaica, na Kipre, na Gavajach, na Korsike. And then we have the Volga, which is a river that runs through Russia. So if you wanted to say by the Volga, then you would say na Volge. But if you wanted to say inside the Volga, so if there's a fish in the Volga, or sometimes if there's a boat or anything in the water, it would be v Volge. Then na Chuzhbinye in foreign land, na Kamchatke in Kamchatka, which is a region in Russia near Vladivostok, and then na Chornom More in the Black Sea. But if it was a fish again in the Black Sea, then it would be v Chornom More. Finally, kind of a funny rule, if the country ends in iya, so even if it is an island, in Russian that is, so Australia, Greenlandia, Novaya Zelandia, and so on and so forth. If it ends in iya, then it takes v. V Australii, v Greenlandii. So even though those are islands, it's v. And then just last of all, for some reason, Krym, which means Crimea in Russian, goes to Krymu, but takes v. V Krymu, v Krymu. So just going into the bodies of water thing a bit more, v generally refers to things underneath the surface, submerged in water. If you're talking about the chemicals or bacteria inside water, then you would use v. If you were talking about animals or the seabed, anything like that, you would use v. Then with na, if you see something on top of water, like the horizon or a boat or a weird light, then you use na. The thing with boats is that v and na can be used to say at sea and to refer to boats on the sea, but we're going to go into that in more detail later on in this lesson, so stick with me until then. And then finally, luge. So voluzhia means in a pool of, in a puddle of. So if you're kind of surrounded or in a pool of like something, some substance, then you say voluzhia. And then if you're slipping on a puddle, so naluzhia, if you slipped on a puddle of, I don't know, water, then it would be naluzhia. And then if you wanted to say ducks on a pond, you would say na prudu, because they're on the surface. So here's a list of some natural features and mountain ranges that I wanted to go over with you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, most of the mountain ranges that are in the plural take v. So we have Walpach, Vkarach, Vandach, Vkarpatach, Pyreneach, which are all in the plural and take v. Then we have na Pampiria, na Kavkazia, na Uralia, na Altai. So when I say in the singular, I do mean in the Russian singular. So Ural is the Urals in Russian, it's singular, so it's na Uralia. Then we've got some exceptions because Balkani means Balkans, it's in the plural, but it takes na for some reason. And then Varabiovich Garach, na Varabiovich Garach means in the Spara Hills, and for some reason that also takes na. And those you kind of just have to remember, unfortunately. And then on to natural features. So I may have mentioned earlier, there's not really that many rules to distinguish. So for instance, we have the Arctic, which takes v, but obviously it's a wide open space, so you would expect it to take na, but it doesn't. You kind of just have to remember that it's Varktike. And then similarly with Pustinia in the desert, it's v, for no apparent reason. Then we have Stepi in the steppe, and Vlesu, which makes more sense, Vlesu. Then with na, these are words that take na, na lugu in the meadow, na nizmenosti, in the lowlands, na возвышенности in the highlands, na полюсе in the pole, na поляне in the glade, na равнине in the plain, and na целине in virgin soil. So here's another table showing some geographical features. One thing I wanted to note here was that if it's a point on a compass, then it will always take na. So na severie, na vostokie, na юге, на западе. Those all take na. The second thing is the word mir and the word svet both mean the world. And their meaning kind of changes depending on whether they use v or na, but that's something that we're going to discuss in more detail later on in this lesson, so don't worry about that too much now. And that's pretty much everything I wanted to say about this. It can be more as a reference guide for you if you forget which noun takes v or na. So finally, in the geography section, we have cities, villages, and administrative regions. So generally, these usually take v. The only exception here would be земля, which can take na if you're saying like on our soil, on our land, something like that. If you wanted to emphasize on, then you would say na. Here we have the example в земле Bavaria, in the state of Bavaria. And if you wanted to say something that's in the ground, then you would use v. The third use of the prepositional case is to indicate the time or period when an event took place. So for time expressions, usually the accusative is used or occasionally the instrumental. But the prepositional case is used for a select few reasons, which we're going to go through now. So if you want to say last month, this month, next month, or anything to do with in this time period. So месяц means month, год means year, and век means century, and they all take v. So if you want to say in one of those, then you use v. В январе, в феврале, в марте, and so on. I have written a table of all of the months of the year within the next few slides, so you can have a look at that and their prepositional forms. В этом месяце means this month or in this month. В прошлом году, last year. В прошлом веке, last century. So if you want to kind of pinpoint a period when an event took place, then you would use v. На takes неделя, which means week. So неделя always goes with на прошлой неделе, на следующей неделе, that would mean next week, на этом неделе, this week, and so on. So usually the expressions take v, but неделя takes на. Then we have a handful of expressions to refer to sunrise, sunset, dawn, dusk, and so on. And those usually take на. So на восходе, на закате, на заре, на рассвете, which means respectively at sunrise, at sunset, and at dawn. But then for some reason there's the exception of в сумерки, в сумерках, which means at dusk. So here is just an overview of all of the time expressions that take v and na. As you can see, most of them do take v. Na is only really used with the sunset, sunrise, and dawn expressions, and obviously with nedelia. With minut, na is used with sports games. So if you said in the 35th minute, then you would use na to form that expression. So if it's talking about sports games, then use na, but in pretty much every other expression, I think it's v. And then we do have a couple of exceptions down there. I'm not entirely sure why those are exceptions or why they use na, like na moем веку, but that's Russian for you. And then the next slide is just the months of the year. The one thing I wanted to mention here is the stress change. So from September up until February, for some reason, all of the months take an end stress, and then the months in between those have fixed stress where the stress usually is in the nominative form. So it will be в сентябре, в октябре, в ноябре, в декабре, в январе, and в феврале. Then it's just в марте, в апреле, в мае, в июне, and в июле, as usual. The fourth use of the prepositional is to describe what someone is wearing. And for this, v is almost always used. So instead of using a verb to wear, in Russian, you just say the person is in what they're wearing. So, она в красной блузке. She is in a red blouse, or she is wearing a red blouse. Он был в черном костюме. He was wearing a black suit. Он был в шортах. He was wearing shorts. And она обычно ходит в джинсах. So this is an expression that you may come across. It is more common to say она обычно в джинсах. She usually wears jeans, but you can also say она обычно ходит в джинсах. The fifth use of the prepositional case in Russian is to talk about means of transport. So на in this case generally means by. Ехать на автобусе, to travel by bus. Ехать на поезде, to travel by train. Ехать на машине, to travel by car. На трамвай, by tram. На метро, on the metro. And then we have the set phrase плыть на пароходе, which is quite rare, means to travel by ferry. And лететь на самолете, which literally means to fly on the plane. Лететь на самолете. When you use в with reference to a means of transport, you generally use it when you're talking about doing something inside of the vehicle. So for instance, в автобусе жарко. Inside the bus, it is hot. So в автобусе жарко, because it's inside specifically, it uses в. Я выучил уроки в поезде. So because you're doing that inside of the train, it's в. Я выучил уроки в поезде. I did my homework on the train. Я сидела в машине. I was sitting inside of the car. Я сидела в машине. Холодно в трамвае. Холодно в трамвае. It is cold in the tram. В метро очень громко. В метро очень громко. It is very loud in the metro. Oh, sorry, in the tube or in the underground. And then with плыть на пароходе, which means to travel by ferry, on ships and boats, на is always used, even if it's in the ship or the boat. You don't use в, you just use на. Lastly, он обедал в самолете. So he had lunch inside the plane, it's в. Он обедал в самолете. So hopefully that makes sense. Basically just remember that if you're generally saying how you got somewhere, you use на, and if you're saying any action that you did inside of that, then you use в. The sixth use of the prepositional case in Russian is to describe moods, emotions, or physical states. Now, the prepositional case is slightly rare in this context, but there are examples of when it is used, and those I've written out here. Na is almost never used. It's always v for moods, emotions, and physical states. So it does correspond quite closely to the English. We would also say in a rage, in bliss, in good condition, and so on and so forth. So она в хорошем настроении. Хороший is good. Настроение is a neutral noun meaning mood. So она в хорошем настроении. She is in a good mood. Ты в восторге. Восторг is delight. Ты в восторге, you are delighted. Ты в бешенстве, you're in a rage. В бешенстве means in a rage. Бешенство is rage, it's a neutral noun. And в блаженстве is in bliss. Again, блаженство is bliss, another neutral noun. Then with physical states, just like in the English, we say in good condition. So в хорошем состоянии. Состояние is a neutral noun meaning state or condition. Хороший means good, so в хорошем состоянии. And then finally, в ее, in her, присутствии. So присутствие is presence or attendance. В ее присутствии is in her presence. The next use of the prepositional case in Russian is to denote extent or scale, and for this, v is certainly the more common preposition to use. So here we have some set phrases, в крупном масштабе, on a large scale, в какой-то мере, in some measure, в такой степени, to such an extent or to such a degree, в некоторой степени, to a certain extent, в малой or в большей степени, to a small or to a great extent, в разной степени, to varying degrees. And then в with the prepositional is also used to express distance at which something is located. So whether you're measuring it in minutes or kilometers or hours or however you're measuring it, if you're saying that from here to there it is this amount, then you use v and the prepositional. So for example, в 2 минутах от центра города. В 2 минутах, so that's 2 minutes in the prepositional case. 2 minutes from the city centre. В километре, 1 kilometre, ходьбы, of a walk, at станции, from the station. В 5 часах езды, so 5 is 5, and here в 5 часах is at 5 hours, езды, journey, at Москвы, from Moscow. So don't worry too much about all of these confusing case endings and any new vocabulary. The point that I want to get across is just how the prepositional is used and the uses of the prepositional in general. So lastly, in this phrase, на каком расстоянии, so расстояние is a neutral noun and it just takes на расстоянии. На каком расстоянии is at what distance, and then you would answer with в. So it can be a bit confusing. Let's just move on from there. So now we've covered all of the specific uses of the prepositional case that I was going to cover today with you. Now we're just going to look at some nouns which differ in meaning dependent on whether they're being used with v or being used with na. So what we're going to do in the next 2 slides is really focus on the specifics and the technicalities of the prepositional case. So if you really want to master the details of the prepositional case, then you can watch these slides. But if you're a beginner and you're just getting a hang of the prepositional, then don't focus too much on this. This is more about the subtleties and the very specifics. So vozdug means air. And if you say v vozdugje, it means up in the air or pervading the air, such as a smell or a plane, or if there was pollen or any chemical elements. Anything in the air, surrounded by the air, is v. With na, it has more the meaning of something being put out in the air. So for example, if you're drying something in the air, drying your laundry in the air, or flying a flag in the air, then you would say na vozdugje. Then we also have these expressions of na vozdugje meaning outside, so na свежем воздухе, in the fresh air, na открытом воздухе, in the open air. And if you just say na vozdugje, it just means kind of outside. Then we have высота and глубина, height and depth. So when you use v with either of these, there's an absence of quantification, which basically means you're not talking about how deep or how high, you're just saying, for example, in the ocean depths. Whereas if you use na, then you are specifying a specific measurement, so depth of 3 meters, na глубине. Then we have глаз and глаза, so that means eye and eyes. If you're using v with these, then it's to express emotion or opinion. So глазах would be in his eyes, and then there was suffering, and then on the surface you would use na to say if there's anything on the surface, so contact lenses, or if he had a bug in their eye, or anything on the surface of the eye, you use na. Then for gora, iti v goru, this is just a set expression meaning to go uphill, but na is the more common expression meaning to climb a mountain. And then na used with mountains will also refer to a specific mountain. Okay, now dvor. So dvor is kind of a thing that we don't really have, at least in England. So in Russia, there are these buildings that will often be in kind of a square shape. And then in the middle of the buildings, there's an open space with kind of grass, or it can have different things, but it's basically referred to as a yard, a dvor. And when you use v with dvor, v dvorje, or v dvarach, then that is referring to that kind of yard, specifically that Russian kind of yard. Whereas when you use na, you will be qualifying it differently. So if you're talking about specifically a stable yard or any other kind of yard, then you would use na. And then na dvorje also means outside generally. So na dvorje, it is winter, zima. Zima is winter, but let's not focus on that now. And then finally we have miesta. So there are lots of ways that miesta is used. I'm not going to go through these now. I'll just say that generally v is used with miesta to talk about a general place, and na is referring more to specific or fixed places. So for example, everything in its proper place, you would use na. To stand still is like to stand on a specific place, so you use na. Am I sitting in your place? It's referring to a specific place, it's na. And then the money is where it was, you would say na prejšnjem mjeście, which means in its previous place, so like where it was put in that fixed area that it's referring to. And then we've also got this expression of if I were you, na vašem mjeście or na tvojom mjeście. So it can be used more figuratively, and then it can also be used as replacement, and it's very often used in this sense. So blocks of flats have sprung up in place of waste ground. So if you're trying to translate in place of or instead of, then you use na mjeście. We've also got these set expressions of w drugom mjeście, somewhere else, and w raznych miastach, in various places. So as we've mentioned with bodies of water, if something is submerged by the sea or surrounded by water, then you use v. So if you see a fish in the sea, it's v, morje. With na, you usually use na to describe things on the surface or on the seashore, but with the phrases of a ship is out at sea or in the open sea, then you do use v. I guess you could think of that as the ship being surrounded by the sea, not seeing any land, it's encompassed by the sea, and therefore uses v. Then with nieba, meaning sky, v is preferred for birds, aircrafts and sounds, so it's kind of similar to voistuche in that respect. And then na, it's a very subtle difference, but na niebie can refer more to things in heaven, or like if you're talking about God in heaven, or if you're talking about like anything across the sky. So for example, lights in the sky, you could say na niebie. You could also say v. So v and na can also be pretty much interchangeable. There's really not much difference, but those are some slight nuances that I've mentioned there. Then we've got akno, meaning window, and v aknie means visible at the window, whereas na aknie means on the window or on the windowsill. So flowers on the windowsill, for example. Polje means field. Now v and na, the difference is very slight. So v is just used more generally, so out in the fields, without specifying which fields or anything, whereas na does refer to a specific field and can qualify fields. So on a battlefield you would use na, or in a wheat field you would use na to qualify it. Then ruka and ruki, in one's hands. This is quite a significant difference. So v ruki, v ruka, sorry, v rukie, v rukach means in one's hands, and then na rukie, na rukach means in one's arms. So you may know that in Russian, ruka means either hand or arm, so v and na are used to distinguish which it is. And then we've got some set phrases which you can have a look at. So basically, if a library book is out, then you just say kniga na rukach. And if you say that somebody has a family to support, then the set phrase is u niejo or u nievo simja na rukach. Then the word sviet means it can mean both world and light. If it's used with v, then it means light, and if it's used with na, then it means world. So v sviecie means in the light, both figurative and literal, and then na sviecie means in the world. Stiele is a village, Veselje is in a village, and Naselje is in country areas. So this is quite common with derevnia, for example. That can also mean village or countryside. I'm not sure why those ideas are so interchangeable, but there you go. Then with seredina, which means middle. If you say v seredinie, it usually means that you're surrounded by something, it's enclosed, it's encompassed, whereas na seredinie is more temporal. So in the middle of a conversation, or in the middle of halfway through reading a book, for example, whereas v seredinie is like if you're in the middle of a crowd, then you're surrounded, if that makes sense. Then studia is kind of just a semantic difference, which I'm not going to go over. And then sud means in the courtroom. V sudie means in the courtroom, sorry. Na sudie is at the trial. Ucha is ear, and v uche will either emphasize directed sound, or it will be talking about something that's literally inside of your ear. Whereas na is more commonly used to talk about the ear in general and the outside of the ear, and just general ear-related expressions. So now we're just going to practice putting that into context, what we've just gone through. So она стояла blank желтом свете солнца. So remember, na svecie means just in the world, and v svecie means in light, or in the light of. So it will be v. Она стояла в желтом свете солнца. Number 2, blank одной руке у него ребенок. So when it's referring to arms, it is на. На одной руке у него ребенок. Вы стояли, you were standing, blank середине толпы. So if it's in the middle of the crowd, it's surrounded by people, it uses в. Вы стояли в середине толпы. Number 4, blank в воздухе повис странный запах. So запах is a smell, странный is the adjective for strange, повис means it was hanging, and blank воздухе. So there was an odd smell in the air. Because it's a smell and it's kind of pervading the air, it uses в. Then we have the set phrase blank в вашем месте я бы принял его предложение. If I were you, I would accept his offer, and that always uses на. На вашем месте. It's kind of following this idea of replacement. It always uses на for that. Then у тебя blank в руках мои очки. Очки is glasses, our glasses, and if it's in the hands, then it's в. У тебя в руках мои очки. Then lastly we have вы видите самолет blank небе. So this is going to be в because it's suspended in the air. Вы видите самолет в небе. So really well done if you got any of those correct. They were really difficult, and I realize it's very subtle sometimes, and the nuances are hard to grasp. So really well done. So here's a list of some of the nouns with irregular prepositional forms. This can be quite confusing because they're only irregular when it's used with v or na, when it's talking about somewhere that is in or on somewhere. So if you use the preposition o, as in talking about, if you're talking about a bridge, then you would say o mostje, or about a garden would be o sadje, or sadje. So yeah, that can be a bit confusing, but these are definitely the more common forms of these nouns in the prepositional. And the stress usually lands on the end. As you can see, also some have vowels which kind of disappear. So lob, which means forehead, just goes to na lbu. And same with rot, meaning mouth, it goes to va rtu, rtu. And with moch, meaning moss, it's vamchu. And then we have also ljod, meaning ice, which goes to na ldu, which can be quite difficult to pronounce for non-native speakers. And then also we have corner and meadow, which are very similar words. We have na lugu for meadow, in the meadow. And corner can be used with either v or na. It's kind of interchangeable. And the differences are very subtle. So these are just kind of nouns that you have to remember. There's no rule kind of that will help you. Not that I can see anyways. So unfortunately you do just have to memorize these. So for the last part of this lesson, we're just going to have a look at the uses of pri and the uses of po, which are the last two prepositions that we haven't looked at, which govern the prepositional case. And then I'm going to show you some expressions and set phrases that also use the prepositional case. The first meaning of the preposition pri used with the prepositional case is to express during or while something is being done, and also when something is done as a reaction. So let's start with point number one. We have during the lifetime or reign of. So pri and then followed by a person's name. If they're a political leader, it usually means during their reign. So we have On žil pri Nikolai I, which means he lived during the reign of Nicholas I, while Nicholas I was in power, not Nicholas I's lifetime. So that's usually what it means when it's talking about political leaders, but it can also mean during the lifetime if you're talking about non-political leaders or if it's just specified. So pri жизни Anli would be during Anna's life, and pri Stalinie would mean under Stalin's reign, under Stalin's government. And then pri socializmie, it can also refer to political movements. So pri этом режиме, under this regime. And then we have pri советской власти, under Soviet powers, or while Soviet leaders were in power. Similarly, for point two, we have while something is being done. So if there is a process during which something happens, then you could use pri. So for example, они теряют продуктов при транспортировке. They lose groceries, продуктов, during при транспортировки, during transport. При взлете would mean during takeoff. При перевозке, during the move, and so on. Then finally we have to express a reaction. So it's kind of like upon. If you translate it as upon, then that kind of expresses the meaning. So он содрогнулся при одной мысли о поражении. He shuddered at the mere thought of defeat, or upon thinking about defeat. При этих словах она побледнела. At these words, or upon hearing these words, she grew pale. So you could translate it as at or upon for a reaction to something happening. Pri is also used to express something being adjacent or attached to something else. So буфет при вокзале would mean the station buffet. Дом стоял при дороге, the house stood by the road, and so on. Then it can also be used, it often goes with возможность, which means opportunity, to say при каждой or при первой возможности. And then при is also used in conjunction with условия, which means condition. Мы сделаем это при трех условиях. We will do it under three conditions. So if you ever want to say under the condition that, then the word you use is при and then условия. And then in the presence of, so ссориться при гостях would mean to quarrel in the presence of the guests or in front of the guests. При свидетелях, in the presence of witnesses. And then lastly, to denote various types of state or circumstance. So obviously that's kind of vague. But if you want to denote a source of light, then you would say pri. So pri свете лампы, при лампе also, under the lamplight. При таких обстоятельствах, under such circumstances, or under these circumstances, or in these circumstances. And then it's also used for при температуре, and then whatever the temperature is, при температуре. Finally, we have the preposition по. Now, in spoken Russian, this is quite rare. It's sort of equivalent to an English speaker saying upon something happening. So it's mostly used in literature or in official business documents. So по истечении визы, on expiry of the visa, по окончании университета, on graduation, and по получению письма, on receipt of the letter, or upon receiving the letter. Then we have по возвращении домой, upon returning home. So again, it's quite formal. You would mostly see this in literature. And по ее смерти, upon her death or on her death. Finally, we'll just have a quick look at some verbs and expressions which govern the prepositional case. Here are some common verbs that are followed by na and govern the prepositional case. So when you want to say to speak in a language, then you say говорить на, and then the language followed by языке. Язык means tongue, but it can also mean language. So она говорит на 3 языках. She speaks 3 languages. You can also say я говорю на испанском. I speak Spanish, or на испанском языке. I speak Spanish language. The second verb is жениться на. Жениться на. So this means to marry a woman. The literal word is kind of to wife oneself. Жена is wife, and the reflexive means to oneself, so get a wife for oneself. Он женился на ее, he married her. And then the final verb here is играть на, and that is used when you're talking about playing musical instruments. So они играют на скрипке. That means violin, so they play the violin. Here are some verbs which are followed by о that govern the prepositional case. So жалеть о is to regret or to be sorry about, заботиться or позаботиться о, знать о, мечтать о, рассказывать о or рассказать о, слышать о, сообщать, сообщить о, and узнавать or узнать о. And here are some verbs that are followed by в and which also govern the prepositional. So I'll just go through them quickly. We have нуждаться в, обвинять or обвинить в, признаваться, признаться в, сомневаться в, убеждаться or убедиться в, уверять, уверить в, участвовать в, играть в, and that's for games or sports rather than musical instruments. Верить, поверить в, вмешиваться, вмешаться в, одеваться, одеться в, поступать, поступить в, превращаться, превратиться в, and стрелять в. So here are some more expressions with в and на that govern the prepositional case. So the expression в самом деле is used for confirmation or emphasis, whereas на самом деле has a slightly different meaning. It implies contrast, so it can be translated more as actually. Then we have кататься на коньках, which means to skate or to ice skate. Ходить на лыжах, which means to ski. And then на воле is an expression of at liberty. Then быть на пенсии, the pension is always used with на, the preposition на. Then на второй, на третьей скорости. So скорость means speed, but in this expression it means in second or third or fourth or fifth gear, and it uses на. На ранней стадии, at an early stage. Во всех отношениях, in all respects. So отношения means relationship, but here it means in all respects. And then we have во всяком случае. So всякий means every or any. Случай means case. And there are two expressions. There's во всяком случае, and на всякий случай. So the one with на is in the accusative, and it means just in case. На всякий случай. Whereas the one in the prepositional used with в во всяком случае means in any case. So like in any case, it would have turned out like this. Then na morozie is in the frost, moroz is frost. And finally, na skvozняки. Na skvozняки. That's a very rare word, but it means drought, and it's in a drought, goes with na. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. I'm sorry that it was so long and detailed and a bit confusing at parts. I hope that it has been useful nonetheless and can act as a reference guide for you if you need to come back and remind yourself when v or na is used or what the uses of the prepositional case can be. Just a quick kind of shout out to the grammar books that I took a lot of content for this lesson. So Terence Wade's A Comprehensive Russian Grammar and Derek Offord and Natalia Gogolitsina, their Using Russian Grammar has helped a lot in this video, so I just wanted to accredit that. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope it's been useful. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section and I'll let you